Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here in such great numbers. It is always nice to see this room full of people for a great cause, the environment, or the conservation of the environment. With us this evening, we have two people from Habitat, sorry, mon Dieu, Habitat, and also Sophia with us, Fuga, who will be speaking a few words in a few minutes. To those who were here for the original consultation period, thank you again for all of your contributions. You will see how these were put to good task. And just keep in mind that this is about changing the way that we use land, the way we occupy land, and to do it in partnership, one with each other. This is not about setting new bylaws or whether putting more restrictions, but to collaborate in how we want to preserve our territory for us, but also for the generations to come forward. So perhaps to learn from others, some great people who came and defended better practices here in Hudson, whether it was pesticides or land use, and also to take into consideration the way that First Nations also occupied this land and have this tradition of always giving back to the land more than they take away. So I hope that this evening will incite great reflection and also great input on your part as we step in the last phase of this process of the conservation plan, guided by Sophia here. And I'm very proud to be part of this team. So Sophia, thank you.
All right, I got it. I won't take too much of your time. As Mayor Hutchison said, my name is Sophia. I'm responsible for environmental projects at the town of Hudson. I work for the Urban Planning Department. Mon nom est Sophia. Je suis responsable des projets de nature environnementale à la ville de Hudson au service de l'urbanisme. J'aimerais vous informer que la présentation ce soir est enregistrée. So please be advised that the presentation is recorded. So we all have to be on our best behavior. Les conférenciers sont tous bilingues, so we will do our best to speak in both languages. Writing environmental policy is not an easy task. The team at Habitat have consulted with many stakeholders and local actors, local environmentally minded groups, with council, and with the population. So tonight is the third time that the population's input is requested. In September, a survey was launched, and then in November, you may have been here with us, it was the workshops. We received, on a reçu 600 réponses au sondage. That's a lot of people when you count, that's over 10% of the population. That's a significant amount. I think, I'm not a statistician, but I think it's significant. Une cinquantaine de personnes ont participé aux ateliers. Donc, il y a eu une belle participation. Les résultats de ces consultations qui ont fait ressortir vos priorités de conservation seront disponibles bientôt. Vous pourrez consulter les rapports sur le site de la ville. So the results of the survey and the workshops, is that me? Okay. Which will soon be posted on the town website, were instrumental in highlighting your conservation priorities. And as expected, Sandy Beach has been identified as an area of high environmental and social value to Hudson residents. All natural areas in Hudson were considered, and many of them are of high value. So the conservation plan focuses on the whole territory rather than only one area. Alors ce soir, les biologistes d'habitat feront un retour sur leurs nombreuses analyses. Et ensuite, ils proposeront du contenu pour le plan d'action. Ces propositions ont été élaborées à la suite des analyses et des consultations avec le public, les membres bénévoles du Comité de l'environnement et le Conseil municipal. The biologists also consulted regional plans, so plans from the CMM and the MRC. They also consulted reports written by local specialists, such as the volunteers in the Conservation Working Group, also known as the CWG. Numerous studies were also consulted that were previously undertaken by the towns, such as past conservation plans. It was important to note the progress that had been made in terms of legislation to protect trees, wetlands, and their buffer zones, and to see what could be improved upon, like the addition of an action plan to keep us on track. It was a lot of work, but it was worth it, and it is still worth it because it is ongoing. Tonight we can propose quantifiable targets and concrete actions to reach the conservation goals. I would like to take a second to thank you all for coming, taking the time out of your busy schedules, and we hope that you will share your thoughts afterwards. You can scan the QR codes on the way out to access the comments form. Je vais répéter en français parce que c'est très important. Merci d'avoir pris le temps de vous déplacer. Tout le monde est très occupé. On le sait que vous êtes occupé, mais on l'apprécie beaucoup. On espère que vous partagerez vos réflexions. Vous pourrez balayer le code QR sur les murs ici en sortant pour accéder au formulaire de commentaires. Alors, sans plus tarder, les biologistes d'habitat Sylvia Wood, avec un nom comme Sylvia Wood, je ne pense pas qu'elle aurait pu étudier autre chose que l'écologie et les forêts. Ensuite, Julie Faure, nous présenterons maintenant la version préliminaire du plan. Si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez les garder pour la fin. So without further delay, biologist Sylvia Wood, Julie Faure will now present the preliminary version of the conservation plan. And if you have questions, we ask that you keep them for the end. We will have a short question period. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and I want to also extend a warm welcome and a thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to come here today. It's great to see so many people motivated and excited about conservation. It's fantastic. Also, thank you, Mayor Hutchinson, and to Sophia for the warm welcome and also for the support throughout this project. It's been really wonderful to work with such a team of people who are dedicated to these causes. So today we're here to present to you the outline of the preliminary version of the Conservation of Natural Areas Plan for the Town of Hudson. Tonight's plan is, well, maybe I'll start by asking, was anyone here at the consultation in November? Wow, fantastic. So you know what we're talking about. Did anyone here, if they want to identify, fill out the survey? Ah, fantastic. So hopefully you'll see some of the ideas that you shared with us reflected in some of the things that we're going to propose today. We're not going through every single detail, so there might be things that we don't have time to dive into, but hopefully we've tried to capture as much of your ideas and your energy and try to figure out how to bring them into practice in this conservation, in this action plan. So for the plan tonight is to give you a quick overview of the steps that we've taken to date as we've built out this conservation plan, to quickly go over what are the objectives, the goals of this evening, and how to provide feedback on what you hear from us tonight. Then to dive into what is a conservation plan, what are the sections, what's the material that's going to be put into this conservation plan, and give you a little bit of taste of what that looks like. And then I'm going to hand the ball over to my colleague Julie, who's going to dive into the action plan and some of the more detailed questions about targets and goals and these quantitative points that Sophia mentioned. And then finally, at the end would be sort of just a quick wrap up in terms of what are our next steps to bringing this to fruition, and having a question period at the end to try to respond to any of the points that you maybe weren't clear or you'd like to ask a little bit more detail about. Alors moi aussi, je vais essayer de faire ça de manière assez dynamique, français-anglais. Alors, pour vous faire un récap des étapes que nous avons réalisées dans le montage de ce projet, c'est un projet qui a démarré en juillet, en été passé. Alors, ça fait à peu près 6-7 mois que nous sommes en réflexion ensemble. La première étape, c'était vraiment le montage d'un portrait du territoire. Alors, on est allé sur le territoire, on a visité les milieux humides sur le territoire de Hudson pour le caractériser, pour savoir c'est combien de milieux naturels que vous en avez, c'est quoi la composition, c'est quoi la répartition des différents types qui se trouvent. Par après, dans l'automne, nous avons fait des analyses sur les caractéristiques de biodiversité qui se retrouvent sur votre territoire. Alors, sont où les points chauds, les points moins chauds dans la biodiversité? C'est quoi la connectivité écologique entre les grands noyaux d'habitat qui se trouvent sur le territoire? C'est quoi la vulnérabilité ou la résilience de vos forêts, vos milieux naturels face au changement climatique? Pour nous donner une idée de c'est quoi l'état, la santé de vos écosystèmes et c'est quoi la capacité de maintenir la biodiversité qui est présente sur le territoire. Secondly, we started doing also at the same time consultation processes. It sounds like many of you guys have been engaged with us in that journey. So we had the survey back in October, the workshops in November, and today is the next stage of that, which is the presentation and public consultation on the plan. And lastly will be the plan. So late this spring is when we're planning to deliver the plan. And so we have a few more months to integrate comments and finalize the actions that are going to go into that. So this is why it's so important to get your feedback at this point to make sure that those pieces all come together. So the goals for tonight are really to provide you an overview of the structure of the conservation plan, its content, and then also the action plan. So this is a document that is accompanying the conservation plan, which dives into more detail and concrete measures about how to actually realize the goals that we're putting in the conservation plan. So they're two documents, but they really work together. And so just to keep that in mind, the conservation plan is sort of setting the context, giving a vision, and the action plan is how do we get there. And so we're going to present those two pieces to you tonight, and then throughout the evening, through the question period, try to take on some of the comments or feedback that you can provide to us. But secondly, as Sophia mentioned, there's a survey that will be circulated or a feedback form. We'll ask specific questions and get your input. So we can, if we don't have a chance to talk to everyone tonight, we can still hear from you. And I'm not sure, I think that's going to be open for about 1 to 2 weeks after tonight. 2 weeks, I've just had confirmation. So, une des choses que vous voulez qu'on aille, c'est la même terminologie, une terminologie commune lorsqu'on parle de la conservation, parce que c'est un concept assez large et englobant, mais ça peut avoir plusieurs différentes interprétations. Alors, on s'est dit que c'est important de réitérer c'est quoi les terminologies que nous allons utiliser, nous, dans ce plan de conservation et ce soir. Alors, la première, c'est la terminologie de milieu naturel. Pour nous, c'est n'importe quel milieu qui est une forêt, un milieu humide, une rive ou un plan d'eau, dont le milieu naturel est non bâti, mais qui peut quand même inclure des petites choses comme les sentiers ou un banc pour accéder à ce milieu-là. Aussi, la conservation du milieu naturel implique que le milieu demeurera non bâti dans le futur, mais qu'on pourrait avoir des améliorations comme l'ajout d'un accès public qui pourrait avoir lieu. Alors, comme j'ai dit, ça peut avoir des changements, des petits bâtiments ou des petits sentiers qui permettent d'accéder à ce milieu-là, mais en général, son forme reste plutôt naturelle. Et ces définitions, il ressort d'une cadre de terminologie de Limoges qui est adoptée au Québec, dont la conservation est vue comme une terminologie parapluie. Ça englobe plusieurs différents types d'actions qu'on peut considérer sur le territoire. Ça inclut autant la protection, l'ensemble des actions qui visent à vraiment maintenir l'état naturel d'un écosystème. Alors, on peut penser des fois à cloche de verre, mais aussi des choses qui sont juste un peu plus restrictives en termes des actions qu'on peut mettre dans ces milieux-là pour s'assurer qu'ils ont vraiment des dynamiques naturelles qui est au cœur de leur fonctionnement. On a aussi la restauration. Alors, l'ensemble des actions qui visent à réétablir le caractère naturel des écosystèmes qui sont peut-être dégradés ou perturbés. Et finalement, aménagement, qui sont les actions qui visent à augmenter, améliorer les services écosystémiques rendus par ces types de milieux. Souvent, on pense à la récréation, accès à la nature. On veut améliorer les espaces pour qu'on puisse sortir ces bénéfices aussi pour nous, pour qu'on puisse accéder. Alors, on va utiliser ces trois terminologies le long de ce soir, alors juste pour qu'on ait tous la même compréhension. All right, so now we have the conservation plan. Let's dive into the deep end. So the conservation plan is a document that is structured around 5 major sections. And so tonight we'll describe each section and give you sort of an insight into the type of content that's going into that section. And then I'm going to pass the puck to my colleague Julie, who's going to give you a bit more detail about the action plan. So this conservation plan has 5 sections, as I mentioned. The first one is to recap that portrait of the territory, which we did last summer, to provide that as context for what comes afterward. Secondly, to review the other types of planning frameworks that are out there that might inform how Hudson develops its own conservation plan. We want to make sure that it's aligned with other conservation plans, whether they be at the MRC level, the metropolitan level, or even larger, so that everyone's working in concert. We also then have a section on biodiversity, so revisiting those analyses that we did that help to provide the sort of orientation of which areas maybe need certain types of interventions, which areas to intervene in first. Secondly, to describe the public consultation process that we've gone through. And lastly, to actually present the natural areas that were prioritized through this process. So I went through that quite quickly, but I'm going to go through each one of those and provide a slide that gives you a bit of content about what that section is actually going to contain. So premièrement, c'est le portrait du territoire. Alors, comme j'ai dit, on a fait le travail de visiter une grosse majorité de vos milieux naturels sur le territoire en juillet. Et nous avons utilisé une cartographie géométrique pour identifier c'est quoi la quantité de milieux naturels qui restent sur le territoire, c'est quoi la composition de ces milieux naturels et à qui est-ce qu'ils appartiennent. Alors, de ceci, nous avons conclu qu'en général, vous avez à peu près 40% du territoire qui est toujours en milieu naturel, dont à peu près 78% est en milieu forestier. Alors là, on voit en vert des secteurs qui sont des forêts. On voit en vert clair, ce sont des forêts feuillues. En vert moyenne clair, ce sont des milieux mixtes. Et en vert foncé, ce sont des milieux qui sont plutôt conifères. Le bilan de ceci est des milieux humides. Vous en avez beaucoup. À peu près 22% de vos milieux naturels, ce sont des milieux humides. Alors, ils sont soit des milieux ouverts ou soit des milieux humides forestiers. Et ils se trouvent souvent le long ici et partout dans ce secteur-là. Nous avons aussi évalué à qui appartiennent ces milieux naturels. En général, la ville, ils ont à peu près 5% du territoire de tout Hudson appartiennent à la ville. Ce n'est pas beaucoup. Le reste est en propriété privée, mais de ces 5%, ça représente 10% de vos milieux naturels. Alors déjà, il y a une capacité de la ville de réfléchir à la gestion sur ces territoires et ces milieux naturels eux-mêmes, mais le bilan reste sur les propriétés privées. En termes des milieux qui sont actuellement conservés, on a 2% du territoire de Hudson qui a un statut de conservation actif, ce qui représente à peu près 5% de vos milieux naturels. Une chose à souligner, c'est la plupart des territoires de la ville, c'est des milieux humides. Alors, ce qui reste, c'est qu'il n'y a pas un gros pourcentage du territoire forestier qui est protégé à date. Alors, c'est quelque chose à garder en tête. On a besoin de aussi penser à c'est quoi les mécanismes pour chercher des actions de conservation dans les milieux forestiers qui se trouvent surtout dans les milieux privés. Et ceci est vraiment important parce que les forêts, c'est les milieux typiques d'une région. On est dans un écosystème forestier par défaut. Alors, ce sont les habitats les plus importants pour plusieurs espèces. Alors, l'autre partie, c'est la matrice agricole urbaine, dont, oui, une portion de la biodiversité peut y habiter, mais ils vont vraiment chercher des milieux forestiers comme des habitats essentiels pour la reproduction et pour le cycle de vie. Alors, c'est pour ça qu'on fait un peu l'accent sur les milieux forestiers. The next section that we talked about was the planning frameworks for conservation. And so the aim behind this is to make sure that Hudson's conservation plan is anchored in other conservation plans and networks that are happening at different scales around you. and that it supports those efforts and also aligns with the global framework as well. And so we did a large amount of work finding what are the other conservation planning frameworks that are out there that are actually in place, and how can this conservation plan align with those. So Hudson sits at sort of the smallest scale in terms of community action, but it sits within the MRC Vaudreuil-Soulanges, which has its own priorities. So we have a green forest corridor, we have a PRHH, Plan Régional des Milieux Hydriques et Humides. That's a hard one to translate in English. The wetlands plan. The CMM has a metropolitan planning effort as well as goals set for how much of their territory they'd like to have conserved as natural areas. And all of those are sort of happening at a relatively regional, local scale, in which actions at Hudson can have very direct impacts on how these other plans are achieved. But we can also take a step back and think about what's happening sort of at these higher scales. So in Quebec, we have the Plan Nature, which is a local embodiment of the global biodiversity framework. And so these are global frameworks in which 196 different countries have signed on to try to bend the curve on biodiversity by aligning our efforts and around a certain set of targets. So there are 23 targets in those frameworks that transcend all levels of society, and we want to make sure that what we're doing here locally is contributing to that high goal as well. And so we've tried to draw a line between all these different frameworks to make sure that what we're proposing here aligns with these other ones and helps to build a momentum amongst you and your colleagues and your neighbors to try to achieve these goals. Alors, une partie de ce travail, c'était vraiment de creuser dans des documents locaux et régionaux. Alors, du part de la ville, ils ont transmis des documents qui étaient pertinents, de regarder à plusieurs outils que vous aviez déjà en place, comme les règlements municipaux sur le zonage, les pesticides, les arbres, la politique de l'utilisation des parcs. Aussi, on sait qu'il y a un plan d'urbanisme qui va s'en venir bientôt aussi. On veut que ceci s'aligne aussi dans la même vision, ainsi que d'autres politiques d'aide financière. Et on a trouvé aussi des documents au niveau régional du MRC de Vaudreuil-Soulanges qui pourraient aussi avoir une implication sur ce qu'on fait ici à Hudson. Alors, la politique de l'arbre et boisé, le SADR 3 de la MRC, et eux aussi sont dans un processus de réfléchir à leur plan climat, et ils ont un plan des réseaux des milieux humides et hydriques qui est à venir, et un PDZ qu'on pourrait consulter. Alors, nous avons fait le travail de relire, de voir c'est quoi les connexions entre tous ces documents-là et ce qui est proposé sur le territoire de Hudson. Alors, juste pour vous donner une idée concrète de qu'est-ce qu'on cherche dans ces documents-là, mais on voulait voir c'est quoi les zones de prioritaires qui ont été identifiées à différents niveaux. Alors, à gauche ici, c'est le corridor vert qui est identifié au niveau du MRC. Alors, on voit que dans cette partie-là, c'est beaucoup les milieux forestiers de Hudson qui ressortent comme partie de ce corridor vert. Alors, on veut garder ceci en tête lorsqu'on réfléchit à c'est quoi les actions à mettre de l'avant dans notre plan de conservation. Également, on a les milieux humides d'intérêt métropolitain du CMM, alors, et aussi les milieux terrestres d'intérêt du CMM aussi. Alors, ils regroupent beaucoup des mêmes milieux que nous avons identifiés, mais juste pour s'assurer qu'il y a une très forte concordance entre ce que nous, on a pris en compte et ce qu'eux, ils proposent comme des milieux d'intérêt. Alors, il n'y a vraiment pas d'écart entre ces deux approches-là. Ils sont très alignés. Et on a aussi plongé dans les études qui ciblaient vraiment le territoire de Hudson. Alors, plusieurs groupes nous ont passé ou on a transmis des documents, surtout qui traitaient les différentes études qui ont été faites sur le territoire pour nous informer de qu'est-ce qui était déjà fait, c'est quoi les enjeux, etc., qu'on pourrait prendre en considération dans le montage du projet, du plan de conservation. Alors, nous avons consulté le nouveau PMAD qui est en révision actuellement, le plan directeur de l'eau, le rapport du CIMA+, et les recommandations dont Sophie a mentionné du CWG, ainsi que des études aussi qui a touché par Cobavard et l'Université de McGill sur le cours d'eau de Vivery, l'étude aquifère, ainsi que les anciens plans de protection des zones de recharge, le nouveau plan directeur sur les parcs et espaces verts de la ville de Hudson et le plan de protection des sources d'eau potable, ainsi que notre rapport aussi qui était émis en 2019. Alors, là, ça fait le tour du cadre de planification qui ont été fait partie de la réflexion. Maintenant, on s'embarque dans la partie biodiversité, analyse, qui ferait la troisième section de notre rapport. Comme mentionné avant, et pour ceux et celles qui étaient ici en novembre, vous avez vu les résultats dans toutes les cartes, mais on a fait l'analyse de la biodiversité en termes des points chauds, la diversité fonctionnelle des forêts, la vulnérabilité et menaces biotiques et abiotiques, ainsi que la connectivité écologique. Alors, il y avait plusieurs jeux de données qui ont été produits à travers ce processus qui nous aident à informer sur c'est quoi l'état de la santé, de la condition de ces milieux naturels. Est-ce qu'ils sont bien connectés? Est-ce qu'ils sont isolés? C'est quoi les types d'actions qui devraient peut-être être réfléchis dans le cadre d'un plan de conservation? Et nous les avons tous mis dans une analyse de priorisation. Alors, l'idée, c'est de faire sortir les zones qui regroupent le plus de value en termes des critères de biodiversité sur votre territoire. Alors, si on regarde cette carte-là, c'est un peu difficile, mais les couleurs qui sont en jaune-vert, je dirais, avec ce projecteur, ce sont des zones qui ont sorti comme étant de très hautes valeurs écologiques sur le territoire de Hudson. Alors, il y en a plusieurs. Ils sont un peu repartis sur le territoire et chacune a leurs forces et faiblesses en termes des critères qu'ils sont en train d'englober. Mais ça donne un bon point de départ sur où sont les valeurs écologiques prioritaires sur votre territoire. La prochaine, c'était nos activités de consultation dont vous étiez vraiment impliqués. Alors, vous allez vous souvenir de la sondage en octobre où on a demandé c'est quoi les activités que vous engagez dans les milieux naturels. What are the types of areas that you want to visit? Are you willing to promote or pay for certain conservation actions to get an idea of the types of activities how you're currently using these spaces? In November, the workshop really tried to identify what were the community's priorities for conservation. So we had you to identify of the different groups of areas, which were the ones you thought needed to have the attention first in terms of the conservation plan, and what types of actions would you like to see, or what are sort of the novel techniques you've heard of in other areas that you think could be interesting to consider in Hudson. And so we took all of this, which was a lot of great information, really, really rich, so thank you so much for sharing it with us. And what we did was we created its own prioritization layer. So in the middle, so on the left here, this is the data-driven prioritization layer that Habitat produced based on the different analyses that we were able to conduct. In the middle, this is a prioritization based on the feedback that we received from you in the November workshop. So we tallied how many people voted for different areas to be first in consideration for a conservation plan, and also what kind of activities should be included. And we combined these two layers to come up with a synthesized conservation prioritization approach. So this layer includes both the scientific, data-driven priorities, as well as the social community priorities that were shared with us last November. And so by combining these two, we can really start to focus on areas that have high value for biodiversity, both from a biological conservation perspective, but also that are the most meaningful and important to people in this room and the wider community. And so 3 big sections pop out to us when we look at this map. We can see sort of around Creek 53 that there's an area here. I think the Nichoir is also in this area, and so there's a lot of interesting values that pop up here. And we have Sandy Beach and this corridor with the Viverie through here that comes up as an area of interest. And also, I think this is Como, where there's a lot of wetlands as well as forests that are of very high interest as well. And so those are 3 areas that we think are important to focus in on. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Julie, who can give you a bit more detail.
Thank you, Sylvia. With the results of the consultation and the different analyses that we've done earlier, we came as Sylvia said, there are 3 zones, 3 corridors identified earlier with the studies and the results of the consultation. So the conservation plan will be on these 3 corridors. So what's interesting is that these corridors also connect themselves through the water course, and taking action, like conservation action in each of the big corridors, will allow to keep healthy natural areas on all the territory. During the second workshop, we asked you what were the solutions that existed and could be implemented on the Hudson territories. So we gathered all these ideas, and they were all in 6 different themes. So there is the conservation, policy, landscape management, education, also to found funding programs for the action. And the responsibility was a big theme, as the different action will be taken from the town, but also the population and stakeholders of the territory. So with all this, we talked with the town and came to the vision for the action plan. So the vision is what we want to achieve in 10 years with the action conservation plan. Donc, en français, la vision, ça donne qu'en 2035, on souhaite que les milieux naturels de Hudson soient en santé et contribuent à la conservation des corridors de biodiversité. On veut qu'ils soient résilients au changement climatique, mais aussi qu'ils offrent une qualité de vie exceptionnelle aux générations actuelles et futures. And in English, I can let you read. To achieve this vision, we propose to implement different actions, and these actions are separated in 4 different strategic orientations. So the first one is to identify ecological corridor and protect natural areas. The second one is that through active management, we will enhance and restore ecosystem to increase environmental benefits. The third one is to mobilize the community for active participation. Thank you. In conservation, and the last one is to facilitate a respectful community access to nature. For the last one, it's really to achieve an equilibrium between the conservation and the recreation on the natural areas. So I will now go directly to the action plan. So it will, as Sylvia said, it will follow the conservation plan, and it will be in the same big document. So the action plan is based on different conservation goals. These goals are not only for the territory of Hudson. They came from global goals and regional goals. The first one comes from the CMB, le Cadre mondial de la biodiversité, so they are really globals. And some can be also found in the Plan Nature 2030 or also in the PMAD of the CMA. So the first one that we want to achieve is there is no net loss of natural areas, and I want to really give attention to the net, because net loss doesn't mean that there is no loss, actual loss. It just means that through conservation and restoration, at the end, there is no loss. For the second goal, we want to achieve the restoration of 30% of the degraded natural areas with priority to the ecological corridor that we identified, and for example, the corridor Viviri. The third conservation goal is to conserve 30% of the natural territory and assure a connectivity between the different natural areas. And for this one, there will be a lot of action about the voluntary conservation, because as Sylvia said, a lot of the natural areas are on private lands, especially 20% of the natural areas. La quatrième cible, c'est de proposer d'assurer l'intégrité de 100% du réseau bleu et vert, des corridors bleus et verts, donc bleu pour les milieux humides et vert pour les milieux forestiers. Et cela, l'idée, c'est vraiment de le faire pas seulement sur le territoire d'Hudson, mais à travers tout le territoire de la MRC, donc penser vraiment plus globalement.
Et assurer cette intégrité, ça se ferait notamment via la sensibilisation et l'engagement aussi citoyen, en plus d'actions de la ville. La 5e cible, c'est de conserver les habitats qui sont importants pour les espèces à statut, c'est-à-dire les espèces qui sont en danger, vulnérables ou susceptibles d'être en danger ou vulnérables. Puis il y en a quand même beaucoup sur le territoire d'Hudson. Ensuite, pour la 6e cible, c'est de rendre le territoire et notamment les milieux naturels qui sont les plus vulnérables au changement climatique, plus résilients pour le futur. Et enfin, la 7e cible, ça fait quand même beaucoup de cibles, c'est de maintenir l'intégrité des milieux naturels, notamment à travers des pratiques responsables, durables et des activités récréatives qui vont respecter la biodiversité, notamment dans les corridors écologiques. Puis on verra plus tard que les corridors écologiques comprennent notamment des réseaux de parcs et de sentiers, donc on veut vraiment mettre l'emphase là-dessus. I just want to take a step back just to identify why the regional connectivity and ecological connectivity is so important in the conservation plan. So here what you can see is a map of the Basse-Terre du Saint-Laurent. In the yellow-greenish part, it's the ecological corridor. So it's taken by the wildlife to move, reproduce, migrate, etc. So it's really important to keep the integrity of this corridor. If we zoom on Hudson and the MRC, we can see here in light green that there is a lot of natural areas there, and also at the other side of the river at Aucun. So what we want to achieve with the conservation plan is to keep this corridor, this regional connectivity, especially because during the winter, with the frozen lake, all the wildlife can go through this connectivity. So this is the structure of the action plan. It will be present in 3 different parts. So the first part will be a reminder of the vision and the orientation, and also the conservation goal that I just presented to you. The first part will show the action by different subsection of each orientation, so it's the objective. And for the second part, we will show how each action can be implemented is one of the 3 corridors that were identified for the conservation plan. So a quick reminder of the vision, but I just presented it to you. The structure of the first part of the action plan will be this one. So for each orientation, we will describe the objective, so it's the sub-theme of each orientation, action that we propose to be implemented on the territory, the contribution to each goal, so each 7 goals that I just presented, and for each action there will be a monitoring indicator that allow us to follow the achievements of the conservation plan. So this is a little heavy, but for each orientation it will be presented this way. So you have, for example, the orientation 1 that's proposed to identify ecological corridor and protect natural areas. It is subdivided in different objectives to strengthen the connectivity of natural areas, conserve biodiversity, enhance natural areas, and strengthen protection priorities. For each objective, you will find some different proposed action, and I just want to say that it's a selection of the action that will be in the conservation plan. There will be more of this action. Each action is proposed in a certain term. There is 3 different types of term. Short term mean that they have to be implemented in 1 to 3 years. Midterm, so it's 3 to 5 years, and long term, so it means that it will be implemented at least in 5 to 10 years. And each objective and action are linked with different conservation goals. Je ne vais pas aller à travers chaque action, surtout que vous avez déjà tout qui est imprimé, donc vous pourrez aussi les regarder, puis nous donner votre avis à travers la période de questions ou aussi via le sondage. Mais pour chaque orientation, on a quand même highlighté certaines actions pour vous donner des exemples. Donc, par exemple, pour répondre à l'objectif d'améliorer la connectivité à travers les milieux naturels, les actions qu'on propose, c'est notamment donc, créer des corridors. Ça serait des corridors, donc on va définir vraiment aussi la largeur proposée. Créer une base de données qui permette d'identifier les sites qui devraient être inclus dans ces corridors et qui devraient être ciblés pour la conservation. Puis on propose aussi, puis là c'est vraiment une proposition, ce n'est pas une obligation, mais d'encourager la conservation volontaire, notamment via un programme qui puisse lister tous les outils disponibles pour les propriétaires privés. So here is an example of how we can achieve the second action that is highlighted. So we draw a map of a corridor of 15-meter buffer around each water course on the territory. What you can see, so the green, the green one, it's the tall vegetation, so it's the canopy of the tree. The light green or yellow is the short vegetation, so grass, agriculture, etc. And in gray, it's the short mineral as the road, parkings, or other anthropic structure. So what can be done here is that each parcel or each zone that is in yellow should be a zone on which we could implement action to restore a corridor across the territory. I don't know if it's okay for you. Okay, perfect. So also I talk about voluntary conservation. There are different actions that can be done on your private lands. It's not all voluntary conservation, but I just want to take some minutes to talk about voluntary conservation. So it's voluntary, as it's in the name. It's the conservation of natural heritage on private land by the owners themselves, and there is different options. Voluntary conservation can be to put a nature reserve on a part of the land. It can be a conservation easement, a donation of or sale of property, or even the designation of floral habitat. And the voluntary conservation gives a status to this part of the land that will go from 25 years to perpetuity. If you want to read more about that, there is this really interesting brochure made by the government, and also you can go on the site of the Réseau des Milieux Naturels that's also giving a lot of information on the voluntary conservation. And just to go through 3 different types of concern that can occur on voluntary conservation, we just want to say that, so as it said, it's not a legal obligation. Each property owner chooses to protect a part of or all of the land. Certain action can be can provide tax reduction and or exemption for municipal and school taxes while staying the owner land. So for, I think it's 3 of the different possibility of the voluntary conservation, the land is still the property of the owner. It's not only for big lands. Even if you have like a small wooded area or a river bank, you can ask for it to be preserved with a voluntary conservation. So je ferme la parenthèse là-dessus. Pour la deuxième orientation, qui est de mettre en valeur et restaurer les écosystèmes pour augmenter les bénéfices environnementaux via une gestion active. Je vais juste montrer directement l'anglais comme je parle en français. C'est subdivisé en 4 de nouveaux différents objectifs. Le premier objectif étant d'adapter le territoire face au changement climatique. Donc, notamment, ici, une des actions proposées, c'est d'encourager le verdissement des berges pour aider à la résilience du territoire. Ensuite, on propose aussi des actions pour protéger et augmenter les zones de recharge en eau, pour rendre le territoire également plus résilient. Développer un plan de gestion proactif des forêts et restaurer les milieux dégradés dans le territoire, ainsi que naturaliser certaines aires qui sont déjà développées. Pour cela, on propose notamment d'établir et de réaliser un plan de restauration sur le cours d'eau Vivéry et le lac Pine. Et cela peut être également, on encourage fortement aussi à obtenir le statut de paysage humanisé pour le corridor Vivéry qui permettrait d'assurer sa conservation. For the third orientation, that is to mobilize the community towards an active participation in conservation, the different objectives are to increase the participation of the public in the conservation efforts, to create partnership between the different stakeholders, and to encourage the conservation on private lands. So we highlight 3 different proposed action. The first one is to create a voluntary group of residents to help in the restoration of habitat. The second one is to create an environmental participative budget. So the idea is to have each year a budget for the conservation and the population vote for the project that will be implemented during the year. And the third action that we highlight is to create a support program for private owners on the different actions that could be implemented in the private lands. And finally, to give examples of action is in the fourth orientation. So this one about the access to nature will be really linked to the future plan directeur des parcs because it's about recreation. So it's subdivided in the 3 objectives to bonify the trails through the territory, to educate through nature interpretation, and to encourage, je perds mon anglais, and to encourage sustainable recreational practice and activities on the park. So we propose to rehabilitate the existing trail through different signage that are homogeneous on the territory. And we also propose to improve public access to water through landscape management. So, I just want to take a minute to show that, so all that this is the proposed action, but there are already been some implemented action through the last years. We sorted them by orientation, but you can see that in the last years, 6 different actions have been taken to ensure the conservation and to preserve natural areas around the territory. Also, 3 different actions have been taken in the theme of the second orientation. For example, the adoption of a regulation prohibiting the filling in of all wetlands. And finally, different actions have been taken to sensibilize and increase the participation of the population in the conservation. Donc ça termine la première grosse partie qu'il y aura dans le plan d'action. Maintenant, je vais passer à la deuxième partie du plan d'action, donc qui sera, comme je vous l'ai dit, vraiment comment est-ce qu'on implémente, est-ce qu'on réalise chacune de ces actions dans un des 3 corridors qui ont été identifiés sur le territoire. Donc la structure va être comme telle. Pour chaque corridor, il y aura une présentation, une description du corridor, notamment sa localisation géographique, les milieux naturels qui sont présents et aussi sa biodiversité. Ensuite, il y aura une présentation des forces et des menaces qui sont présentes dans chacun des corridors identifiés. Un lien sera fait avec les orientations et les objectifs qui ont été cités dans la première partie du plan d'action. Pour chacun des corridors, sera présentées les actions à entreprendre pour les maintenir puis les conserver et quels sont aussi les indicateurs de suivi qui permettront de suivre l'avancement des actions et des cibles à atteindre. So just to remind you that there is 3 identified corridors, I won't have the time to go through each, but I want to present to you what can be implemented, for example, on the Viviri corridor. Donc le corridor Viviri, vous le connaissez bien, mais quand même, je vais juste rapidement le représenter. Donc, ce qu'on veut dire par le corridor Viviri, marche plus, c'est tous les milieux naturels qui sont autour de la rivière Viviri, en partant du sud en passant par le sentier Taylor-Bradbury, à travers le Pine Lake, puis pour aller jusqu'à Sandy Beach et la pointe Parson. Donc c'est tout ce territoire-là qu'on veut dire par le corridor Viviri. C'est un corridor qui est important parce que le flux de connectivité écologique est élevé. C'est l'habitat de nombreuses espèces animales et végétales qui sont présentes sur le territoire. Par contre, c'est un milieu dans lequel on va retrouver de la fragmentation écologique, notamment via l'urbanisation et la pression foncière. Donc, par exemple, ici, là, vous pouvez voir on a comme des trous dans le corridor écologique qui serait idéalement à restaurer. Comme on a quand même tout un cours d'eau, il y a de l'érosion des berges et de l'altération de la qualité de l'eau, puis il y a aussi la présence d'espèces exotiques envahissantes. So what can be done on the Viviri corridor? There are a lot of different actions that can be implemented, but here are some examples of proposed action. For the ecological fragmentation, land acquisition and protection can be done, especially in these 2 zones. On peut également faire de la restauration écologique des berges, notamment autour ici du cours d'eau Viviri et du lac Pine, mais également au niveau de la pointe Parson et de Sandy Beach sur le lac des 2 montagnes. There are at least 2 parks that are present on the corridor Viviri. So if we want to achieve the equilibrium between the conservation and the recreation, we need to implement recreational use management plans that allow to access the nature, but still respect the nature. Ça sera important pour garder les milieux naturels en santé aussi, d'effectuer des actions de contrôle des espèces invasives qui sont sur le territoire. And finally, we can also implement action that will allow us to monitor the water quality and the biodiversity health to follow the action and the goals that we want to achieve. So that concludes with the second part of the action plan. So I will do a quick progress report and tell you about the next step. So, as Sofia and Sylvia said before, we have mobilized the different stakeholders. So, we have met with the cities, with the different conservation organizations. We have done workshop and a survey with you. And also, we really want to have your feedback from tonight. We have proposed a different strategic orientation to direct conservation efforts. And we have identified certain priority sites that require protection and restoration. Donc, les prochaines étapes, ça va être la rédaction finale du plan de conservation. Avec vos retours de ce soir, on va développer un cadre d'action qui soit plus concret en incluant des mesures réglementaires, écologiques et incitatives. On va aussi affiner les actions et les indicateurs de suivi qui permettront de mesurer l'avancement et l'impact des initiatives. Et à travers le plan d'action aussi, on va également proposer des partenariats stratégiques pour assurer la mise en œuvre des actions à travers le territoire. So now I think there is like a 30 minutes question period. I think that if you want to be heard online, you have to come to the mic just to ask your question. Thank you.
Salut, merci pour la présentation, merci pour votre travail. Adrien Burke, j'habite ici à Hudson. I guess I'll ask my question in English. Obviously I'll have to read the plan d'action completely eventually. So I mean, this may be too premature, but I see a lot of wording in here that I would call aspirational. So encourage, let's say, words like that are repeated. And I know that we said we wouldn't talk about bylaws or anything, but the alternative to laws are other things like incentivizing or incentives, right? To encourage people to do certain things. So I was wondering, you did mention quite a bit the conservation of land that's privately owned. At least, you know, mentioned that maybe 20% of what we're going to conserve could come on private land. And obviously, we need to find ways to encourage people to do that. I didn't have time to read that report, download it, the one that you gave the link to. But in my experience from having worked with Arter, CPTAQ in Quebec, and then also in Vermont with what's called current land use, you know, my experience, I mean, this might come as a surprise to people in the room, but in Quebec, things are quite hard, bureaucratically speaking. Let's just put it that way. And when I compare it to the experiences that I've seen in Vermont, it's really amazing. It's day and night. And the difference, because we're talking about private landowners, the difference is that they make the process easy, but they also accompany people. They really help people along. So my question is to encourage people in Hudson to do this. I don't think the onus can be on the town necessarily unless we find some source of money, but to navigate the levels of bureaucracy, I think it's going to be very hard and it's going to dissuade a lot of people. I'm willing to do it for my land, 6 acres, or not all of it. I need to live on part of it and grow some vegetables. But so my question is, you know, can you give us some of examples that you've seen elsewhere in Quebec where the town has taken a leadership role to encourage and concretely to accompany people in that process? Because if, like I said, in Vermont, the current land use, what happens is you register, the forester comes, they come up with a forestry management plan, they come, you know, every 2 or 3 years after, you can cut trees on your land, they help you out with it. You know, it's actually amazingly straightforward, and more importantly, there are tax breaks, tax incentives, so there's the incentive part of it. So I was wondering if you could give us some examples in Quebec of how that could work and how our municipality could do that, take that leadership role without being a huge burden on maybe Sophia or having to hire somebody new. Thanks.
Tu me complètes? Parfait. Merci beaucoup pour la question. Thank you so much for that question. It's a very good point that you bring up, because everyone has limited time and limited money and limited energy to put towards these things. So trying to reduce those barriers to move towards voluntary conservation is going to be very important to actually make that a viable option for a lot of landholders. The groups that we've previously worked with do this. I think the one that comes to mind initially is Nature Conservation Canada, and CNC en français, qui accompagne beaucoup de producteurs pour identifier c'est quoi les plans de conservation volontaire qui that fits their needs and fits their perspective, sorry, mixing up my French and my English, the best. They also, I know, have worked at sort of a community level with communities to do sort of the same sort of exercise that we've done to figure out, well, which of the landscapes are probably the most interesting to see if landowners are interested in putting them into conservation, so that sort of same sort of prioritization. And they'd be one of the groups that are well placed to help accompany people, but I think a lot of other land trusts and fiducies have also those skill sets, and so maybe it's also about compiling resources and having a resource center at the community scale here in Hudson that can help to navigate those things and then create those links to other groups that have already gone through that process. So there's sort of a community of practice or a community of learning for people who are interested in voluntary conservation, so they don't feel that they have to navigate the system on their own. But I think that's a great point to think about and maybe elaborate on as we think about these types of processes that we can put into place in this conservation plan.
Bonjour, Chantal Perrault, résidente d'Hudson. Merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Deux petites questions. Je voulais savoir pour vos prochaines étapes, là, qui est de finaliser tout le plan. Là, vous entrevoyez how long do you think it will take for you to finalize this conservation plan?
I can answer. We plan to finalize the first draft of the final conservation plan around May, and after that it will be, so the city will go through this and it will be finalized in June this year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Second question, how do you make the choice to put something in a term of 1 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years or 5 to 10 years? What are your criteria to say we have to tackle this one in a shorter term than a longer term? Because for me, when I look at Viveri, restoration of Viveri and Pine Lake and all that, and the corridor Viveri, it's 3 to 5 years. And, you know, is it something that is manageable by the town to choose that, okay, that is written 3 to 5 years, but we're going to do it 1 to 3 years? Or so I'm just wondering how you came to establish those terms.
Can I answer in French?
Oh oui, il
Okay.
n'y a pas de problème.
Merci. Donc, c'est sûr qu'on a estimé certaines dates, puis en particulier l'exemple que vous donnez, je pense qu'on est un peu, on estime que ça va être plus rapide que ça va l'être.
Okay.
Puis il y a encore des ajustements qui vont être faits sur ces termes-là. Ça a été proposé par rapport à ce qu'on a vu qui a déjà été réalisé dans d'autres, par exemple, plans de conservation ou ailleurs. Puis ça a été un petit peu, pour l'instant, la revue par la ville, mais c'est sûr que ça sera encore à valider que ce sont des termes qui sont réalistes. Oui.
OK, parfait. Merci.
Hi. We didn't hear anything about destructive insect species in the action plan. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah, of course. So one of the analyses that we did at the outset was a vulnerability analysis of the forest stands. And so we looked at what percentage of each forest stand presents a vulnerability to 16 different biotic threats, so these insects, diseases, and pests. And we have analysis that ranks how much of that forest stand could potentially be affected if that pest arrives on the landscape. So one of the ways that we have brought that into the action plan, and it wasn't detailed, but in this idea of making the forests resilient to climate change, because we know a lot of these pests are starting to overwinter, which is leading to the outbreaks that we're seeing. And so we're going to have to take action today to think about, well, what do we plant when we're going to go and do restoration or management plans? You know, do we need to be replacing some species already so that in 10 years we have a viable alternative species in place that's already starting to provide those ecosystem services? So a lot of the sort of the fine details of how to address that are sort of baked into this climate resilience part. And so in that, there are sort of more prescribed actions around, you know, these sites are particularly vulnerable to these species. We think that they're going to be one of the first places that are going to be touched. We recommend going in and either doing, you know, replacement planting or diversification to try to minimize those impacts. So that's the major area where we see an ability to try to prevent and manage that risk in advance.
On a une question en ligne.
Ooh.
Caroline, please.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation this evening and for making it bilingual. I am going to ask if one of the documents that you spoke of in describing the amount of land that the town of Hudson actually owns versus the amount that's private, if you would be able to put that, your speaking notes, which were extremely detailed in comparison to what is actually available when you look at the chart itself. I would love it if you can put that online so that we can reread that. You did the majority in French.
Oh, I see. So in terms of the slide where we're talking about the percentage of land that's owned by the city of Hudson and how much that represents in terms of the natural areas. So just to recap in English, the city owns 5% of the territory of Hudson, and that 5% represents 10% of the natural areas. It's predominantly your wetlands. On the territory also, there are 2% of the territory is protected by conservation statuses, so they're part of the registry. And those 2% cover 5% of your natural areas. So just to give a sense, much of the landscape that has some element of protection tends to be wetlands, and that's often part of the laws that protect against the destruction of wetlands right now. And so what is vulnerable on your landscape are the forests. There aren't very many spaces where there's a good level of protection of your forested landscapes because most of them happen to occur on privately owned lands. We could try to write that up in a summary, I guess, and share it afterwards if you need a written statement.
That's great. No, I appreciate you repeating that. I presume that this conservation plan is also going to overlap somewhat with the Parks and Green Spaces plan, especially as it reflects on forest and trails and trail connectivity.
Yes, absolutely. That's something that's been made very apparent to us, that these two processes are sort of happening in parallel, and they really need to make sure that they speak to each other. So that's an active area as that plan takes form to make sure that it's reflected in our document as well.
Great. And then lastly, the only thing that I'm going to ask you sort of as a part two to Chantal's question is when I'm looking at the different orientations and the objectives, I'm just wondering why you have them in an order where you don't have your short-term goals, if you will. You start with the 1 to 3 year, but you start instead with the 5 to 10. So as I'm reading it, I'm looking and thinking, wow, I mean, that's really a long way out in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And then you come in and the next one is 1 to 3, and then the next one is 3 to 5, if I'm looking at orientation 1, for example. I'm just wondering why you've set it up that way versus starting with all of your short term, going to middle, going to long.
Yeah, I don't think that there was a particular structure around the time frame. As Julie mentioned, these are a subset of all the actions that are currently under discussion, and so we extracted those that we thought were sort of the most important to share with you tonight. There are other actions also that are in consideration in the action plan, but I think it's a great idea to think about how they get presented, to start with, well, what do you need to do first, second, and third, to help structure how to put that action plan in place. So thank you very much for sharing that feedback. That's great.
Super. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Megan Webster, citizen of Hudson. Thank you so much, all of you, for your extraordinary work on this strategic plan. It's very exciting. My greatest concern with the strategic plan is that future mayors, future councils will put this beautiful document in a binder and forget about it. And so I'm curious about what the accountability plan is once the strategic plan is really formally adopted, finalized, signed. What is the plan to make sure that in 10 years, these actions that are due to come up as completed in 10 years will be completed? And can you speak a little bit about the accountability mechanisms that you plan to put in for future potential, rogue councils that get distracted with other things? Potentially.
So I think one of the key ways that we're trying to make an accountability framework is providing indicators that actually allow you to track whether actions have been done or not and how far you are towards achieving your goal. But it does require a commitment from the city and from citizens alike to hold the city accountable to those things too. And so I think that's where it really becomes a participative project that is owned not only by the city, but is owned by the population of Hudson as a common objective that you're all working towards. And so that if it does start to veer off or lack focus, that there are people who are there who keep pushing it forward. And so I think there's a big focus in the action plan on participative approaches, so setting up groups who are going to spearhead restoration efforts, the financing, I think, too, if there's available budgets, that's something that also keeps people engaged and focused. I don't think there's necessarily a regulated kind of fashion in which to force a group to that. That's also not part of our mandate necessarily. I think that really comes down to how the City Council wants to think about setting this up in a long-term fashion. But I think building a solid foundation for this conservation plan is what generates the energy to keep it moving forward. And so I think that's why it's such a central part of it is around public engagement to try to realize a lot of these objectives. And it doesn't just fall on the council themselves to do everything. Because I think then you risk falling into a place where priorities potentially change and it gets pushed to the side. But if really it's a whole of society approach, then everyone has a responsibility to keep moving it forward.
Hi, Sylvia. Thank you very much for the presentation today. You mentioned indicators, and that's my curiosity as Kevin Slark, resident. Baselines, benchmarks, indicators, with the data collection and monitoring that's going to be needed in terms of, how are we going to measure it? What are the baselines that'll be proposed in terms of comparing when something needs to be restored? What does it be restored to? I'm thinking about vulnerability and adaptability to future climate conditions. Thinking about, there's a heavy focus here on focusing on the vulnerable areas and vulnerable species, but in reality, we should be looking at the entirety of it, given, if climate change changes certain areas to become more vulnerable. Can you speak a little bit in terms of where you guys see in the conservation goals, particularly, some of these metrics are thrown out, no net loss of natural areas through conservation and restoration, but what are the benchmarks and what are we comparing to and what are we restoring to? Because what we might want to restore a condition to the past might not actually be what it is in the future. So I'll leave it at that.
So we propose to use different monitoring indicators, but some of them are indicators that have already been installed by the CMM. So on the site of the CMM, there are different maps showing how So it can be the different natural areas. So it's really, yeah, it's updated every year. So it shows how the landscape will change with time. And there is different indicators that can answer so these different topics. So it can be the conservation status, the resilience to climate change, and yeah, so there are different this kind of monitoring indicators. I don't know if it's respond well to your question.
Well, maybe I can add one or two more points, is that there's sort of two types of indicators. One are action indicators. Have we done this? Yes or no? Or how many hectares has it happened on? And so those are very easy to keep track of. They don't require a lot of resources. And then there are the indicators that say something about the condition of the site that's changing through time that you're trying to track to see, is the action that we put in place having the consequence that we want on the ecosystem? Is the biodiversity coming back? Is it stable? You know, is it deteriorating because of climate change? And I think that's where I think your question is sort of more aimed towards figuring out what the different baselines could be. And so as Julie mentioned, there's already lots of different existing data sets that can help to act as those baselines, as are the data sets that we are providing today. And so I think it's thinking about constructively which of those data sets best fit the type of action that's put in place in each area. And so each time we're going to have to do a little bit of thinking about what is the appropriate indicator to be applying and what's the appropriate baseline. And I think the question with regards to restoration, as Julie mentioned, one of the actions is to have a restoration plan. And that would be the time in which the city, with public engagement, would identify, well, what is our reference state? Where do we want to be bringing this landscape back to? And at that point, deciding how are you going to measure your progress through time. So that's not something that we can necessarily say ahead of time, we think it should be this. It's going to be very site dependent and objective dependent, what you want that site to look like. And so I think that it's trying to build in the structures that will allow that process to happen. Whether it's within another group or whether it's internally, I think that those are kind of questions that we can dig into.
George Ellerbeck, 193 Main Road. My wife and I own about 100 acres of the forest you've been talking about. And you have trails going through it. You want 60-meter wide tracks going through it. Forest. You want your trails to go through the forest? You want them 60 meters wide?
No, so it's more that the corridor, so a corridor would be a naturally vegetated area.
Yes.
And so if it already is vegetated, it would stay vegetated. We don't want to change that.
I thought that you were legislating 60 meters wide on these trails.
Not on the trails. So if it is like a wetland, we'd want that the edge of the wetland to have a buffer around it.
Yes,
that
you
is
said
vegetated.
30 meters around wetlands, 60 meters for trails.
By trails, do you mean like water courses, or do you mean?
No, people moving courses.
No, not at all. That's not what we're recommending.
So you don't want people to go across these forests in the Como Forest.
Well, if there are already...
You don't want Rigaud and Vaudreuil linked together so there's a corridor and a trail all the way through?
It's not the same. So it's two different action. So the 60-meter wide is just for the forest corridor. It's just to ensure that the corridor will stay like conserved or preserved on 60-meter wide. But for the trails, yes, of course, we propose to have trails connecting all the regional, the DMRC, but it wouldn't be on the private lands. It would be like just linking the different existing.
So you're not dealing with private land at all when you're having trails?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I'd have to see exactly where the track that you're referring to is. But I think the idea is absolutely to reconnect these green corridors where possible, to try to maintain them wide enough to maintain biodiversity. And it's very possible that those will be going over private land. And so working with those private landowners to see if they're open to, willing to put in that kind of buffer around those areas.
Fine. We have trails across the property where skiers go on and so on. And there's a private property sign on, and they still come across. They bring down fences. They can do all kinds of things of this nature. over the years, we've had a lot of damage from various people. I guess getting to the state right now that people are going there are taking care of the forest. But once again, you're planning all these trails. Who's going to pay for the insurance if a tree falls on someone? I mean, and the reason we have the private signs are that if someone comes out across our trails, if they fall down over a stump or something, it's not our fault. They're trespassing, technically. So now you have to take into consideration that you, during COVID, you almost had to have traffic lights up there for the number of people. That's fine. We enjoy that. However, we don't want anyone to get hurt. Anyway, that's about it for now.
No, but I think you bring up a very valid point that private landowners need to be part of that consultation and part of that discussion about how those actions get actually implemented, what is realistic for those property owners, what makes sense, and what maybe safety measures need to be put in place to make sure that that happens in a respectful way, both for your own property, and then also, for those people who, if you give them permission to cross it, if you don't, then hopefully they would respect that. We're not suggesting that we are encouraging people to trespass on anyone else's piece of property on that point.
Hi there. Could you just clarify the differences between an eco corridor and like the trail network that we're looking to connect? Like we're talking about two different types of connectivity, I think. Could you just elaborate about the actions related to each? Thanks.
Sure. Do you want to? Okay. So the eco corridors are sort of very broad corridors that transect across all of the landscape of Hudson, and they're really there as a mechanism to try to link important habitats for species. And so we've identified 3 major ones. And so species are able to cross urbanized agricultural landscapes, but they don't like it, right? So the idea is to try to make it as easy as possible for them to cross those large spaces by putting in place actions that are maybe to reduce or make agricultural spaces a little bit easier for them to cross. It could be also about making sure your backyard is maybe a little bit more accessible if you want to contribute, but it's not necessarily a defined pathway that has to follow this exact route, because we know animals are zigzagging across landscapes, and we're trying to create enough habitat in a linear fashion that they're able to move from one place to another. And so these corridors don't have to be a contiguous, solid mass of forest for animals to be able to use them. And so it's really about trying to build out enough natural spaces in these pathways that species are able to use them. I think what the alternative is, or the other action plan is around these actual green corridors that are trails and paths that are linking interesting areas that are mostly for humans to use. That we want to have them for recreational purposes and bicycling paths, et cetera. And we want to make them as biodiversity friendly as possible. And so those are 2 different networks, and they have different types of action plans associated with them. So the first one is a much more collaborative, potentially space where people's backyards can be greened, or people are encouraged to plant trees in their backyards to try to provide a bit more green space in these areas that are identified as important corridors to try to promote the movement of species. Whereas the green corridor, the green sort of trail network is more about providing spaces that link populations across the landscape through green spaces. And so those will be much more about sort of like making sure there's a bit of shade cover along the edges, that it's green, that it's climate resilient, and provides those kind of those services, but it's less oriented towards habitat, creating massive amounts of habitat for species. I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I just want that, I'm sorry if this wasn't really clear, but these corridors are not trails, they are eco corridors, as just Sylvia said.
We have time for one last question.
Online?
Nope, no questions online. Everybody seems satisfied here. Oh, one last one. Allez-y.
We were talking about accountability and making sure that this beautiful plan that you're going to write will not be on a shelf and not realized. So I was just wondering, your organization, are you the kind of watchdog that could be hired that every year you could give like, an update on this has been done, this has not been done, or, you know, like we can have somebody that can follow the plan and tell the citizen where it's going and how are we doing as indice de what has been achieved.
Yeah, I think that's something that we could do, and there's also lots of other groups who could do it as well, to have an update to, you know, if there are some elements that need to be analyzed or those indicators need to be calculated, you know, we're very well placed to do that, but I think there's also a lot of internal following that could be possible too, of setting a committee up potentially to track that internally, because not everything I think needs to be analyzed from a perspective of, you know, biodiversity data. A lot of it is about sort of have these actions taken place and figuring out who the right team is. Is it someone internal to the city, or is it really an external group that's necessary? So I think that's a decision for you all to think about.
I think it would be easy to build into the conservation plan a progress report, whether it be biannually or every 3 years. It could be one of the required actions where on fait un bilan. Ici, on a atteint nos objectifs, mais ici, on a encore à atteindre nos objectifs. Bon, ceux-là vont prendre un petit peu plus de temps qu'on pensait. Donc, je pense que c'est quelque chose qu'on peut intégrer.
I think you should put in it somewhere that there should be an update to the population every year, at least every year, you know?
Merci.
That's a good idea.
Alors, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, no more questions. So I'll thank you very much for coming, and I'll remind you before you leave, if you wish to scan the QR code to have access to the comments form. Alors, balayez le code QR, ils sont juste à côté de la porte pour avoir accès au formulaire de commentaires. Vous allez aussi le retrouver sur le site web si vous n'avez pas le temps de le faire ce soir. It will also be on the website. You'll be able to access it there. So we're looking forward to receiving your comments. Thank you and good night.